No, it is not okay to punch people, Nazi or otherwise. Hello, Breakfast Club. Sister Danger here. It's Monday, and I'm actually filling in for Gothic Funk, and he's going to take over my day tomorrow. I know that this video is very late. This topic is really convoluted, and it has just taken me a while to pull it together. Over the last week, there has been a lot of talk about whether or not it's okay to punch a Nazi. And I know that a lot of other YouTubers have talked about this topic, and that it's been all over Twitter and Facebook and the general interwebs. But I usually find the arguments and the answers that I read rather dissatisfying. They are not talking about the moral situation of whether or not it's okay to do this. This whole debate gets really confusing really quickly when people start adding in what I consider to be extraneous, aggravating or mitigating factors / circumstances. And I think that it is defensible to say that it is not okay to punch somebody, regardless of all the other factors that I've seen other YouTubers and people try to argue into the situation. So I want to first back it up and talk about the moral foundation on which we're saying this is illegal or this is not okay because it's illegal. And then I want to add in how other attributes can change that landscape or play into the whole thing. Our laws are not arbitrary. They don't just get made up. They didn't just come into existence 50 years ago. They are an evolutionary body that is founded, it has its base in moral, ethical, philosophical arguments. We arrive at the notion that punching people unprovoked is wrong because we live in a society that has roots in Lockean and Kantian philosophy, which discusses the laws of nature. And the law of nature is that as existing creatures, we have certain rights that we cannot be alienated from by virtue of existing. And Locke defines those rights as life, liberty, and property. Prior to any kind of societal gathering or government, every individual in a pure state of nature has a right to these things and to defend these things for themselves. When we come together in a society under a government willingly, then we enter into a tacit agreement that we will concede certain of our natural rights under the rule of law and instead allow the governing body to mete out justice for transgressions against that law. And we weigh the legitimacy of the laws that we create for ourselves based on whether or not they respect what our society has accepted as our inalienable rights. I'm not really going to argue whether or not individuals may or may not agree or disagree or whatever with the law, because the fact is that by being a citizen of the United States, whether you like it or you don't like it, the laws both apply to you and protect you just as equally as they are supposed to protect everyone else. Whether or not that's working or successful, whether or not we still think our laws are moral and ethical, are all different debates, which I'm happy to have, but they're different debates. So with regards to Spencer, he, like every other citizen, has the reasonable expectation that they are protected duly under the law. He, like every other citizen, has relinquished his own natural right to just go around punching people if he can, in exchange for not being arbitrarily hit himself. So this belief that we each have a fundamental right to our own lives, liberty, and property underscores the entire moral argument against punching one another. And we recognize that this is the prevailing philosophical stance by building our laws around it. So when we say that something is against the law and that's why it's wrong, somewhere prior to that law coming into existence, it has already been argued and debated the morals and ethics of it, and it was argued successfully in a certain fashion, and then therefore laws were built on it. And so the argument against perpetrating physical violence against anyone who is acting within the peaceable boundaries of the law doesn't really need any further aspects or attributes to its defense. It is in and of itself morally defensible to say that it is not okay to arbitrarily go hit somebody without some kind of intervening factor. And that is what I want to move to here a little bit next. In having massive arguments on my Facebook and in other places, I saw a lot of things get thrown in the mix. I've seen them get thrown in the mix by other YouTubers or even YouTubers that I'm in alignment with on this stance, but I still want to talk about them. So in our society, we do have acceptable forms of violence, but those acceptable forms of violence have to be demonstrated that they were acceptable, okay? If you go and you punch somebody, as we saw in the Richard Spencer video, and then you want to say that this is an acceptable form of violence because of X, Y, or Z reasons, if you want to change the landscape of that incident, then you have to show that there are other either extenuating circumstances or factors that weigh into it. And most simply put, we usually look at these as self-defense factors. Was somebody, when they punched the guy out, acting in self-defense? Were they being aggressed by the person? Was that person screaming in their face? Was that person actively threatening violence against them? Did they have the ability to deliver on those threats that they were making? And is there a reasonable expectation that that was going to happen? And if the answers to those questions are yes, then when you throw that punch because someone is screaming and up in your face and calling for all kinds of craziness, then you have a pretty good case for how and why you're acting in your own self-defense. Okay, it's really cold here, and so I put on my hoodie. You guys are just gonna have to deal with that. Another argument that I've heard is that it isn't okay to have punched Richard Spencer for being a Nazi because he has the right to free speech. Well, yeah, that's true. Aside from the fact that it's a violation of his civil rights, it also is infringing on his freedom of speech. And I have heard it said that it isn't because freedom of speech is a contract between the government and the citizens, such that the government can't infringe on citizens' right of free speech. However, the government is tasked with determining when and where people can say or have their freedom of speech. And so in that way, yes, it is an agreement between citizens, because if an area has been designated, as a public area where all people can freely speak, then all people are under the same protections and requirements of the law. Since the government is what upholds the law, then it does in fact fall on them to uphold a particular citizen's freedom of speech, sort of indirectly. Another argument that I've heard related to speech is that people have tried to say that it was okay to have done this to him because he was spouting a whole bunch of hate speech and inciting people to violence or riot. And this is, unfortunately for the people who make this argument, private citizens don't get to be the individual arbiters of whatever they think is incitement. And B, it requires that the violent act ever even actually occurred. So you could say that it was incitement to violence all day, but if nothing happens, then it was incitement to no avail. What a person is perceived to be a symbol of is not incitement to violence or riot, especially when no such event actually even occurs. And a friend of mine asked me in relation to this, wait a minute, are you trying to say that unless Richard Spencer is in the act of said incitements to violence and riot, etc., that it's not okay to punch him, even if those are the things that he espouses all the time everywhere else. And I said, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, because our laws do not hold or punish people based on what they did in the past or what we think they might do in the future. This is exactly why we have habeas corpus laws, which require that you charge somebody. You cannot just indefinitely detain people based on a threat that you think they might pose. And it's also why we have the presumption of innocence and / burden of proof laws, which protect us against wrongful accusations. It's not just morally right to punch Nazis, it's our moral obligation to do so, because that's what Americans do. They punch Nazis. Not true. Let me read to you some excerpts from a book called The Nuremberg Trials. You can look it up. I'll put a link to it in the low bar. It was the American Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, that opposed the plan to just execute Nazis. If leading Nazis were summarily executed, the world would say that their enemies had been afraid to put them on trial and had put them to death to silence them instead. To deny the defendants due process would be to risk making them martyrs in the eyes of their people. At this time, it was America specifically arguing for the notion of putting the leaders of the Nazi Party on trial and giving them due process. And one of our biggest resistors in that debate was, in fact, England, who was more in favor of just shooting them for being Nazis. And eventually, President Truman laid down an ultimatum and said to the UK that it is our objective to establish as soon as possible an international military tribunal and to provide a trial procedure which will be expeditious in nature and which will permit no evasion or delay, but one which is in keeping with our tradition of fairness towards those accused of a crime. The chief counsel, who was Justice Jackson, went on to say, further strengthening America's position on this, that we will show these men to be living symbols of racial hatred, terrorism, and violence, and of the arrogance of cruelty and power. He too was in favor of having a trial. This was America's stance, not just run up and punch Nazis in the face. And it really just rankles me a little bit that people throw out comic books and cartoon memes as if that is some sort of evidence to back up their stance, as if that's some sort of an authoritative reference is the cover of a comic book. It's just ridiculous. Another argument that I just love so much is that if you don't agree that punching Nazis is bad, then that must automatically mean that you are in favor of Nazi agendas and ideologies. It's a false dilemma to even say something like this. If you're not with us, you must then be against us. And it's either ignorance or intellectual dishonesty whenever somebody trots that out. Not agreeing that murderers should be put to death or not agreeing with the death penalty doesn't mean that you advocate running around murdering people. I think that's enough for one video. It's 1:41 in the morning here, and I don't want this to become super long. So Got That Funk will be up taking my place on Tuesday, and please go ahead if you like this video and you like this channel, click the subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, share it around, do the thing, and we will see you all on the flip side.